On the afternoon of May 30th, 1942, a police officer in San Leandro, California, stopped a young couple walking along Estudillo Avenue. It was a routine stop. The man reached into his pocket and produced his draft registration card. The name on the card was Clyde Serra, race white, place of origin Hawaii. The officer looked at the card, looked at the man, and was almost satisfied. In wartime California, these kinds of checks were ordinary curfews, restrictions the general machinery of a country that had been at war for less than 6 months, and was still learning what that meant for daily life. But then the man spoke. He said his name was not Clyde Serra. He said his name was Fred Korematsu. He said he was Japanese American. The officer arrested him. The next morning, the local newspaper ran the story. The headline read, "Jap spy arrested in San Leandro." He was not a spy. He was a 23-year-old welder from Oakland who had grown up in a house on the east side of the bay, the son of immigrants who ran a flower nursery. A man who liked baseball and had a girlfriend named Ida, and had decided when the order came to report to a government assembly center that he was not going to go. He had not gone. He had altered his appearance, minor surgery around his eyes, enough to blur the immediate recognition, changed his name, told people he was from Hawaii, and stayed in the Bay Area with the woman he loved, while 120,000 of his fellow Japanese Americans packed their belongings and boarded buses to places most of them had never heard of. He had almost gotten away with it. And then on a sidewalk in San Leandro, he told the truth. I have thought about that moment for a long time. Not the arrest. The moment before the arrest, the moment when a police officer was about to let him go, and Fred Korematsu said, "Wait, my name is not what I told you. What makes a person do that? What makes a person who has been hiding successfully, who is standing on the edge of freedom, turn back and tell the truth? I don't know the answer. I don't think anyone does. But that question about what it takes to refuse the easier path to say the true thing when the false thing would have served you better is the question that Fred Korematsu's life spent 4 decades answering. To understand what happened on that sidewalk, you have to understand what the months before it had felt like. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. By the end of that day, more than 2,400 Americans were dead, and the country had been pulled into a war it had been watching from a careful distance for 2 years. The fear and the grief and the rage that followed were enormous and real. What was also real and what followed almost immediately was the turning of that fear and rage toward the 120,000 people of Japanese descent living on the American West Coast, most of them American citizens, most of them born in this country, all of them suddenly recast in the public imagination as potential enemies. Fred Korematsu's family had been in California for decades. His father, Kakusaburo, had come from Japan in 1905. His mother, Kotsui, had followed in 1914. They had built a nursery business in the flatlands of Oakland. Grown flowers raised 4 sons. Fred was the 3rd son. He had grown up speaking English and playing with neighborhood kids who were not Japanese, had gone to Oakland public schools, had worked in the shipyards after graduation until he lost his job after Pearl Harbor because his employer decided he could no longer trust a Japanese-American worker. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the Secretary of War to designate military areas from which any or all persons could be excluded. The order did not name Japanese Americans. It did not have to. Within weeks, General John DeWitt issued orders excluding all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast military zones. Assembly centers were established. Relocation centers camps were set up inland in the deserts and mountains and flat agricultural plains of the West. The order applied to 120,000 people. It applied to American citizens. It applied to elderly people and infants and people whose families had been in California since before the turn of the century. It applied regardless of whether any individual had committed any act of disloyalty, regardless of whether any evidence existed that any individual posed a threat to national security. It applied to the Korematsu family of Oakland. Think about what it means to receive that order. You are 23 years old. You were born in this country. You have done nothing wrong. And the government of the United States has told you to leave your home, leave your job, leave everything you have built, not because of anything you have done, but because of the ancestry of your parents. Your mother and father are packing their things. Your brothers are packing their things. Your neighbors are packing their things. The Japanese American Citizens League, the largest organization in your community, is telling people to comply, arguing that cooperation is the only way to demonstrate loyalty, the only way to protect the community from worse. What do? 120,000 people packed their things. Fred Korematsu did not pack his things. The Japanese American Citizens League's decision to encourage compliance is one of the most complicated and debated decisions in the history of the Japanese American community. The leaders of the JACL were not cowards or traitors. They were people operating under conditions of extreme pressure and genuine fear, trying to protect a community that was surrounded by hostility from all sides. They believed, and there was some logic in the belief, that visible cooperation would demonstrate that Japanese Americans were loyal Americans, that it would build goodwill with the government, that it would make the situation less dangerous than it might otherwise become. They may have been right about some of that. The camps were bad, but they might have been worse. History does not give us the alternate timeline. What history does give us is the fact that Fred Korematsu was not seen as a hero by his community in 1942. He was seen by many as a troublemaker, someone whose resistance could be used as justification for harsher treatment of the entire community, someone whose individual choice to fight the order made things more difficult. For everyone who had decided after agonizing consideration that compliance was the only viable path. Some members of the JACL went further than simply encouraging compliance. They reported to authorities Japanese Americans who were resisting the order on the theory that cooperation with the government was essential to the community's long-term survival. This was a painful choice, made under conditions that most of us will never face. It was also a choice that put people like Korematsu in a position of standing against not only the United States government, but the institutional voice of their own community. He stood alone in a way that is easy to romanticize from the distance of decades and is harder to fully understand up close. His family went to the Tanforan Assembly Center in San Bruno, a converted racetrack where families lived in horse stalls without him. His girlfriend Ida, who was Italian-American and therefore not subject to the order, stayed with him for a while, but eventually left. The relationship did not survive the war. He had the surgery. He changed his name. He learned to carry himself in a way that would not attract the attention he had been attracting all his life, simply by being who he was. For several months he moved through the Bay Area as Clyde Serra, as someone else, as a man who had edited his identity down to the parts that were safe to show. And then on a sidewalk in San Leandro, when a police officer was about to let him go, he stopped and told the truth. He said later in life that he had been afraid, that he had been scared since the moment the order came down, and he had decided not to comply. He had been afraid every day for months, and the fear had not stopped him, but it had been there. What he was not, he said, was someone who had planned to become a test case. He was someone who was trying to live his life in the only way that felt possible to him, not leaving the woman he loved, not abandoning the country he had grown up in and considered his own and who got arrested for it. Ernest Basig, the director of the ACLU's Northern California office, visited Korematsu in jail shortly after the arrest. He asked if Korematsu would be willing to serve as the plaintiff in a case challenging the constitutionality of the exclusion order. The ACLU needed someone willing to fight. Korematsu, who was 23 years old and in jail and had just had his life dismantled by a government order, said yes. The case worked its way through the courts over the following 2 years. A federal district court convicted Korematsu of violating the exclusion order. He appealed. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction. He appealed again. On December 18, 1944, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled 6-3 against Fred Korematsu. The majority opinion written by Justice Hugo Black held that the exclusion order was justified by the military necessity of the war situation. The court acknowledged that the order imposed hardship on a racial group. It held that the hardship was justified anyway. The language was careful and constitutional, threading a needle between the obvious discriminatory reality of the order and the government's argument that wartime conditions required extraordinary measures. Justice Frank Murphy wrote in dissent that the decision went beyond constitutional power and fell into the ugly abyss of racism. He used a word that Supreme Court justices rarely used in 1944. He called the exclusion order a form of racism. He said the majority had legitimized the imprisonment of innocent American citizens based on their ancestry, which he called one of the most sweeping and complete deprivations of constitutional rights in the history of this nation. Murphy was outvoted 6-3. Korematsu was a convicted criminal under the laws of the United States. His conviction was affirmed by the highest court in the country. He was sent to a relocation center, the Topaz War Relocation Center in Utah, and spent the remaining years of the war there, the same as the 120,000 others, except that he arrived later and as a man whose legal challenge had been considered and rejected at the highest level. After the war, he came home to California. He married a woman named Catherine Pearson. He had 2 children. He worked as a draftsman and later in other trades. He moved through the post-war years in the way that many Japanese Americans moved through them, putting one foot in front of the other, building a life from what remained, not talking too much about what had happened. The community around him did the same. There was too much pain and too much loss, and too much that needed doing to spend time looking backward. His conviction followed him not in the formal sense of a criminal record that prevented him from working or building a life, but in the subtler sense of a thing that had been said about him publicly and permanently by the most authoritative institution in the country. The Supreme Court had looked at his case and said this man's treatment was constitutional. That verdict was still on the books. It had not been reversed. It was part of the legal record of the United States available to any government that might want to cite it in the future. His daughter Karen grew up knowing little about the case. Her father did not talk about it at home. This is a pattern that appears across many families of that generation. The silence not of shame exactly, but of a wound so large that ordinary domestic life could not accommodate it, that could only be carried, not discussed. In 1981, a legal historian named Peter Irons was working on a book about the wartime cases when he made a request under the Freedom of Information Act for the government's files on the Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Yasui cases. He was a scholar. He was not expecting to find anything more than the documentation he already knew existed. What he found was something else. Buried in the government's files in documents that had not been part of the official record presented to the Supreme Court in 1944 was evidence that the government had known at the time of the original case that its central justification for the exclusion order was false. The reports of the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Federal Communications Commission had all concluded that Japanese Americans had not been engaged in espionage or sabotage. The military necessity argument, the argument that the exclusion was required because Japanese Americans as a group posed a security threat, had been contradicted by the intelligence agency's own findings. The government had known this in 1944, and it had not told the Supreme Court. The documents showed that Justice Department lawyers had actually drafted language for the government's brief, acknowledging that the reports undercut the military necessity claim and that the language had been removed before the brief was filed at the direction of officials who knew it would damage the government's case. The suppression of evidence had been deliberate. The Supreme Court had made its decision without the information that would have most directly challenged the government's argument. Irons contacted Korematsu, who was 62 years old and retired and living in the San Francisco Bay Area. He told him what he had found. He asked if Korematsu was willing to try again to file a petition to vacate his conviction on the grounds that the government had committed prosecutorial misconduct by suppressing evidence. Korematsu said yes. He said when asked about it later that he had always known he was right. He had known it in 1942, and he had known it every year in between. What the documents gave him was not the knowledge he had always had, but the proof. The proof that could be put in front of a court. The proof that the world could read. The hearing was held on November 10, 1983 in the federal courthouse in San Francisco. The courtroom was full. Many of the people in the gallery were Japanese Americans, the children and grandchildren of people who had been incarcerated, some of whom were coming to a federal courthouse to watch something be undone that had been done to their families 40 years before. Fred Korematsu sat at the petitioner's table. He was 64 years old. Judge Marilyn Hall Patel read her ruling from the bench. She vacated his conviction. She found that the government had engaged in prosecutorial misconduct, that it had deliberately suppressed evidence and made misrepresentations to the Supreme Court. She said the conviction could not stand. The courtroom applauded. Korematsu sat quietly for a moment. Then he began to cry. Outside the courthouse speaking to reporters, he said something that I have returned to many times. He said, I would like to see the government admit that they were wrong and do something about it, so this will never happen again to any American citizen of any race, creed, or color. He said if anyone should do anything, it should be the people of the United States. He was not triumphant. He was not vindicated in the way that the word is usually used, some clean restoration of dignity, some closing of accounts. He was 64 years old, and he had been right since he was 23, and it had taken 40 years to prove it, and the proving had required the discovery of documents the government had deliberately hidden from the highest court in the country. And even now, the original Supreme Court decision Korematsu versus United States had not been overturned. It was still on the books. It remained technically the law of the land. In 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was signed by President Reagan. It provided a formal government apology to Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated and authorized payments of $20,000 to each surviving former internee. Approximately 82,000 people received payments. The last payment was issued in 1999, more than half a century after the camps closed. Korematsu received a Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Clinton in 1998. He was 79 years old. The citation described him as a man who had resisted with quiet bravery. He had not been quiet, he had been vocal and persistent for decades, and the bravery had been neither quiet nor without cost. But the medal meant something. It meant that the country he had refused to leave had decided eventually to say that he had been right. After September 11, 2001, Fred Korematsu was in his early 80s. He had watched the towers fall on television like most of the country, and then he had watched what happened in the days and weeks after the surveillance, the detention without charges, the special registration requirements for men from Muslim-majority countries, the atmosphere of suspicion that settled over communities that suddenly found themselves viewed with the same general hostility that Japanese Americans had faced 60 years before. He filed an amicus brief with a federal court challenging the detention of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. He wrote op-eds. He gave interviews. He said the same thing he had always said, which was that what had been done to Japanese Americans in 1942 had been wrong, that the Supreme Court had been wrong to allow it, and that the pattern he was seeing in 2001 and 2002 was the same pattern running under a different name. History is repeating itself, he said. He died on March 30th, 2005 at the age of 86. His daughter Karen established the Fred T. Korematsu Institute to continue his advocacy work. His case is taught in law schools as one of the most significant failures of constitutional law in American history. But the original Supreme Court decision Korematsu versus United States 1944 was not formally overruled until 2018 in the case Trump versus Hawaii, when Chief Justice John Roberts wrote in the majority opinion that Korematsu was gravely wrong the day it was decided and has been overruled in the court of history. He called the decision objectively unlawful. Roberts also upheld the travel ban on Muslim-majority countries that was before the court in Trump versus Hawaii. The pattern Fred Korematsu spent his last years warning about had arrived, and the Supreme Court had looked at it and found it constitutional. The footnote that rejected the old case was in the same opinion that allowed the new one. I have thought about Fred Korematsu changing his name to Clyde Sarah, about the surgery he had done around his eyes, about the months he spent in the Bay Area as someone else passing as a white man from Hawaii, trying to live his life in the only way that felt possible. There is something in that period, those months of being someone else, that tells you something important about what it means to resist. He was not resisting as a hero. He was not holding a sign or making a speech or going willingly to jail for a principle. He was trying to stay with his girlfriend and keep his job and live in the city where he had grown up. He was a young man trying to make a life under conditions that were trying to prevent him from doing so. The resistance was personal before it was political. It was particular before it was principled. It began with a woman he loved and a city he would not leave. And then on a sidewalk, when the thing he had been avoiding finally arrived, he did not run from it. He told the police officer who he was. He said his name. He let them arrest him. I have wondered if he already knew in that moment that he was going to fight it, that he was not simply surrendering, that saying his name was the beginning of something rather than the end. I do not know. He did not say, in any account I've found, what he was thinking when he handed over the registration card with the wrong name on it and then told the truth. What I know is that 120,000 people were told to leave their homes, and they left. Fred Korematsu was told to leave his home, and he stayed. He was wrong about the law in 1944. He was right about everything else. It took 40 years and a researcher with a Freedom of Information request and a judge who was willing to name what had happened to establish that on the record. The documents that the government suppressed in 1944, the intelligence reports showing that Japanese Americans posed no security threat, were there all along. They were in the files. They were in the same building as the lawyers who wrote the government's brief. They were withheld because the lawyers knew that showing them to the Supreme Court would damage the case for the exclusion order. 120,000 people were imprisoned because of information that was in the government's files and was never shown to the court. Fred Korematsu knew he was right. It cost him 40 years to prove it. He said after the 1983 hearing that he wanted people to know that they should not let things like this happen to them without fighting. He was 64. He had been fighting since he was 23. He would keep fighting for the rest of his life. The question his story leaves behind is the one he lived by, the one he answered in his own way on a sidewalk in San Leandro in 1942, when he could have walked away and didn't. What does it take to say the true thing when the easier thing is right there available and no one would know the difference? He knew the difference. That was enough.